What better way to get up and following that song? That just sends us all into such a wonderful thoughts and ideas. Oxymorons. They're sort of fun. Contradictory terms that we put together to maybe bring out a fresh meaning of a word or phrase. I mean, we use them in everyday speech. Hey, this is your only choice. Bittersweet. Virtual reality. All of these things we use in our speech, and I think we use them not just for literary value, but also because they describe how we live. In many ways, we don't like absolutes as much as we like relativisms. Because in many ways, we don't want to just be pigeonholed into, well, this is the one way that I have to live. We like options. So we have perfect imperfections, sweet sorrow, adult children, or this one, quiet rage. No, I'm not angry, I just have a little bit of quiet rage. We laugh about those, don't we? But it's easy, I think, to sort of carry that mindset into our spiritual life and to live indecisive discipleship. That sometimes we want to follow Jesus and sometimes not. Sometimes we're ready for the hard things. And then other times we just want that life of ease. While indecisive discipleship, we could call it an oxymoron, it is not reality. And we need to be reminded about that and what Jesus calls us to. So I'd like for us to look at that this morning. And as we think about Jesus, Jesus is absolute. He both spoke and lived in absolutes because he is truth. And truth is not partial, it is not relative. Truth is constant. Truth is always the same. And so what Jesus says is, if I am the absolute, what I need you to do is to count the cost of following me. If you have your Bibles, if you would, please open them to Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, and we're going to be reading verses 25 through 35. And the context here is Jesus is walking along, and there are large crowds. There's multitudes of people who are with him at this time. And beginning in Luke chapter 14, verse 25, it says, "Now large crowds were going along with him, and he turned and said to them, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, "This man began to build and was not able to finish." Or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So then, none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions Therefore, salt is good. But even if salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? It is useless either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears, let him hear. The context of this passage, as I said, there are multitudes of people around him. Who wouldn't want a following like that? Large following of people. It seems like that's the way to go. And yet what Jesus realizes is that many are following him for those superficial reasons. Maybe they're just following him because of excitement. This is something different, something new. Maybe they're following him because of healing. Maybe they're just looking to say, okay, well, what's going to happen next? And many of these people have left their homes for this. But what Jesus does is he understands he needs to weed the crowd, to thin it out, to those true followers. Because what he is about, the kingdom that he is bringing, the salvation that he is offering, is only for those who can handle absolutes. And so he gives these words. He says, you need to count the cost of following me. To which he gives two examples. He says, it's like one who is building a tower. He says, you don't want to leave it unfinished because maybe you don't have the commitment or you don't have the resources. He said to do that would be like you've built a monument of failure for all to see, and people would ridicule you saying, why'd you even start that? I mean, if you knew you were going to start it, why? At least have the funds and everything to finish it. He gives another example. He says it's like going to war, a life or death situation. He says you need to realize that you have enough soldiers on your team to go up against an enemy of much greater strength. He says these are just rational things that people do. They consider the cost. They count that cost. And so he is saying, you need to be sure and count the cost of discipleship before you begin, because that cost is so high. You see, Jesus doesn't want us to be surprised. He doesn't want us to get into following him, and then we get to the point where we're like, whoa, hold on. I didn't know that this was involved. I'm not ready for that. Jesus lays it out up front. He says, you need to think about this if you really want to follow me. But I think there's a question for us that I think probably all of us either have or maybe should ask. That is, how do you know or how do you count the cost of discipleship when you don't know what's coming in your life? When you don't know what's going to happen a year from now, 5 years from now, 30 years from now, how do you know how to count the cost? Well, Jesus gives us some cannots to help us understand. He gives us 3 absolutes, 3 things that if we are unwilling to do, he says, you cannot be my disciple. These are not maybes. These are not possibilities that we might fudge this for you a little bit if you get near it. No, he says, this is the line. This is the absolute. He says, you cannot be my disciple unless you hate father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, and self. He's using extreme language here. Extreme language that says, I'm calling you to something that is going to look like hatred of all of your other relationships as you love me. The second one he gives, he says, you cannot be my disciple unless you carry your own cross. When Jesus says that, he does not mean how we typically use that term today. We typically say, oh, well, we all have our own cross to bear. And we sort of mean from the standpoint, oh, we all have a burden to bear. That's not what he's saying here. What he is saying is, are you willing to die an excruciating death for me? You see, when Jesus calls us to follow him, he's really meaning two things. The first is he's saying, I want you to follow me, the person. He's saying it's about a relationship with me, that I want you to connect to who I am and what I am all about and get to know me. But then there's a second part of that. That means he says, follow me. You know what Jesus never does? He never tells us, he never says, hey, I want you to go over there. I'm going to stay over here. I'm going to sit down here, and you guys go over there and take care of that. I've never been there. I don't know what it's about, but you go take care of that. Jesus never does that. What Jesus is saying is, I want you to get right behind me, and I'm leading the way. You follow in the steps of my feet. Where did his feet lead him? It led him to Golgotha, to die on a cross. He's saying, if you cannot be ready to do that, then you can't be my disciple. And then he says, you cannot be my disciple unless you give up all your possessions. Again, we have absolutes in this statement. First, he's saying that this is for everyone. He says, none of you. Meaning he's leaving it out there for anyone. Anyone who his disciple is. So he's talking about any and all. And then he says, all your possessions. Not give up some, not give up a little. He says you have to give up all your possessions for the sake of Jesus. I think when we look at these, we try to look at each one of those individually. And we sort of try to rationale through them, sort of, well, what is meant by hate? Does it really mean death? Do I have to give it all up? And Jesus is using extreme language here. And he's doing it for a purpose. Jesus is not making a rule here. Because we see with the rich young ruler, the ruler came to him, what do I need to do? He says, at the very end, go sell all you have and give it to the poor and come follow me. The rich young ruler went away, sorrowful, because he couldn't do it. But Jesus comes to Zacchaeus and he says, hey, I'm coming to your house today, Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is a wealthy tax collector. Zacchaeus says, Lord, up to half of what I have, I will give to the poor and to the others. Jesus doesn't correct him and say, no, you need to give it all up. So what's Jesus doing here? Jesus is getting to our heart. Jesus is saying, I want to know what your idol is. He's saying, I want you to look deep within you. What is the thing that you hold in highest regard? The thing that you cannot live without. The thing that if it was taken away from you right now, you wouldn't be able to function. What is that one thing for you? Is it your job? Is it a relationship? Is it a possession that you have? Jesus is saying, I want to know what is going to compete with me for priority in your life. Is it relationships? Is it pride in ourselves? To say, no, I think it should be about me, not you, Jesus. Or material things. All of these things are things that we hold dear. And what Jesus is saying is following me requires the highest cost. What he's saying there is you need to go ahead and assume total cost to you so that later down the road you won't be caught off guard. So that later down the road, 30 years down the road, you won't be, well, wait a minute, Jesus, we never talked about this. No, he says, you assume everything needs to be given up for me. And there's no negotiation with Jesus. There's no calculating it. You know, sometimes we say, okay, well, Jesus, I'm in if it's this cost. But if it's this cost, no, I'm out. Jesus is saying, it is all or nothing with me. Because he says, I gave all for you. And so we need to be reminded, because I think years can go by and we easily sort of fall back into this indecisive discipleship. That life of ease, and we say, well, I don't have to give that much to you, do I, Jesus? So let's take for a moment and let's just think about the cost of following. It's not a matter of adding Jesus to your life. I think a lot of people think that. Yeah, I'll be a Christian. I'll just here's my whole life, and I'll just push Jesus right on in, and we'll just mesh it in together. He's just part of my life now. No, that's not what Jesus is saying at all. Jesus is saying, do you not realize that I have bought you by what I did on the cross? 1 Corinthians 6, verses 19 and 20 tell us that very thing, that you have been bought with a price. You are not your own. Nothing you own is yours. You have become a slave of Jesus Christ. And in so doing, he owns everything. What that means then is discipleship involves sacrifice. Paul would write in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, he says, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. I think our first reaction when we hear the word sacrifice, our first reaction is a negative one. That we see ourselves as complete. And so what we immediately do is we start to think, okay, well, what am I going to have to give up? Do you realize that any relationship involves sacrifice? Now, maybe if you're a little bit younger, you may be thinking, nah, it doesn't. Let's just take, for an example, let's take someone who is single versus someone who is dating someone. You may look at it and say, there's not that much sacrifice involved. Yes, there is. Think about it. The single person, they can go wherever they want. They can do whatever they want. What happens the moment that you begin to date someone? You have to start telling them where you go. You tell them what you're going to do. That's just part of the relationship. You give up, you sacrifice freedom when you come into a relationship. But here's the thing. Why do we do that? I mean, if you start out and you go, oh, wow, if you saw a list of all the things that you're going to give up when you go into a relationship, would some of us go, nope, not going to do it? Well, maybe some. But most of us say, you know what? I'm willing to give that up because of the benefit of being in that relationship. It means so much more. I gain so much more than what I give up. You see, sacrifice for Jesus is not how much of me do I give up, but it's what do I gain by letting go. What we value most in this world, whether it is a relationship, whether it is your job, whether it is some sin that you hold on to, those things that you think give you identity, the things that somebody comes and says, hey, who are you? You know, and we automatically say, oh, well, I am so-and-so. I am a doctor. I am an engineer. I am a mom. I am a father. I am a brother. Whatever those things are that we think define us, Jesus is saying, I want you to let that go. Because I am the one who defines you and completes you. Because I made you. It's not about these other things. There's a story that I came across. It's about the pearl of great price. It's by Juan Carlos Ortiz. And he writes, he says, a man sees this pearl and says to the merchant, I want this pearl. How much is it? The seller says, oh, it's very expensive. Apparently, the seller has an accent. How much? Oh, a lot. Well, do you think I can buy it? The man asks. Oh, yes. Everyone can buy it. But I thought you said it was very expensive. I did. Well, how much? Everything you have, says the seller. All right, I'll buy it. Okay, what do you have? Well, I have $10,000 in the bank. Good, 10,000. What else? That's all I have. Nothing more? Well, I have a few more dollars in my pocket. How much? Let's see, $100. That's mine too, says the seller. What else do you have? That's all, nothing else. Where do you live? Well, in my house. Yes, I own a home. The seller writes down, house, it's mine. Where do you expect me to live? In my camper? Oh, you have a camper? That too. What else? Am I supposed to sleep in my car? Oh, you have a car? Yes, 2 of them. They're mine now. look, you've taken my money, my house, my camper, my cars. Where's my family going to live? So you have a family. Yes, I have a wife and 3 kids. They are now mine. Suddenly, the seller explains, oh, I almost forgot. You yourself too. Everything becomes mine. Wife, children, house, money, cars, and you too. Then he goes on. Now, listen. I will allow you to use all these things for the time being. But don't forget that they all are mine, just as you are. And whenever I need any of them, you must give them up, because I am now the owner. You see, sacrifice sometimes is not what we give up, but it's what are we going to do? How are we going to use what we have for God? And I think it's hard because we want that life of ease. I truly believe that the mindset in America is that Christianity is easy. All you got to do is go to services on Sunday morning. What did you say, Anthony? 1.8% of my time? It's pretty easy. And if that is our mindset, then when something else is asked of us, we begin to give excuses. Can't you let someone else do it? You know, it's really not convenient for me right now. Maybe you've given this excuse. I have given so much already. Find someone else. Do you see the illogic in that? Jesus says, give me all. And we're bargaining with him. Well, wait a minute, how much? Jesus says, no. I said at the very beginning, it's all for me. You see, the point is that following Jesus is about giving your life to him, because he paid the price for you. And if he did that, then what it really comes down to is that we are just managing God's things. God's time. God's money. God's possessions. God's actions. It's not mine. It's his. So why is it so hard to follow Jesus? I mean, he said, count the cost, because the cost is high. I think it is so hard to follow Jesus because we do not understand the depth of sin. Sin is what killed us. It separated us from God. And the only way that God could do anything for us was to send his Son, God in flesh, to die for us so that we might be recreated and have a relationship with him. But we still think it's okay to have 1 foot in the kingdom and 1 foot back in the world. And so we still try to find gratification in pornography. We hold grudges rather than offering forgiveness. We try to find strength in what others say about us on social media rather than what God tells us about ourselves. We keep playing with the very thing that killed us. That's why it's hard. All that Jesus asks of us, he says, I want you to become like me. I want to make you better. And it's hard because we keep trying to resist that change and be indecisive disciples. So what does Jesus want? He says, I want your total commitment to me. What are the two greatest commands? Actually, let's actually just, audience participation, let's say them together. The first command is love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second command is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said, that's what I did. That's what it took. I was totally committed to God, and I was totally committed to you. Jesus is asking you and me, are we totally committed to God? And I would say that second part, love your neighbor as yourself, that means are we totally committed to each other? Are we committed to each other here? Or it's like, I mean, yeah, I go to that place there in Concord, but, you know, I go there sparingly. Maybe I talk to a few people, but no, they're great, but God said, love your neighbor as yourself. How much do we love each other here? I mean, I'm not even talking about enemies yet. We haven't even gone that route. I'm just saying the easy part is loving each other here. I mean, I'm not going to make you turn and face each other, but I could and say, hey, who do you know or who do you not know on the other side of this room? Why don't you know them? Well, my life's so busy. I got this, I got that, I got ball, I got work, God says, I want total commitment from you. What are we doing? Yes, there will be times when we fail at this. Our commitment will be divided. There will be times when we choose life of ease over living for Him. Times when we give in to this idea of indecisive discipleship. But we cannot stay there. And I believe that is where God's grace comes and showers down upon us so that we realize, I got to move, I've got to have this desire for Him and Him alone, not the things of this world. And the last point I want to make is that He wants you to understand the cost of not following Him. Paul writes in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Now, if we stop right there, I think all of us could say that is a picture of our world today. And we'd probably all shake our heads and say, yep, that's it, yeah. But Paul doesn't stop right there. Paul goes further and he says in verse 5, holding to a form of godliness, and yet they deny its power. He's not talking about the world right there. He's talking about indecisive disciples. They've gone on and done all of these other things, and yet they're still trying to cling to this. Oh, yeah, I follow you, Jesus. And he says, no, you're not. No, you're not. Because you've given up the power. How many of us are holding to a form of godliness, but yet denying its power? I want you to ask yourself that question. I want you to ask that because I see it here with us in many of your lives. You say, no, Adam, I'm not that bad. What are you not willing to give up for Jesus? What are you still holding on to? Jesus, man, he gives some tough words. Because at the end of that passage in Luke 14, he gives an illustration of salt. He says, what about salt? In that day and age, salt was usually mixed with other elements, other materials. And so if that salt came in contact with water, the salt itself would evaporate and you'd be left with these impure materials. And what Jesus says, on the heels of saying, I need you to understand the cost of being my disciple, and then he says, if salt has lost its taste, it's good for nothing. He says you don't even throw it on the ground. You don't even throw it in the dung heap. He says it's worthless. Ladies and gentlemen, God is telling us if we are indecisive disciples, we're worthless to him. Please, let that ring in your ear. Ask yourself today, am I worthless to God? Not by who you are and all of that. God has taken care of that. What God is saying is, how devoted are you to me? It's either all or nothing. There's no in between. You're either worth great things to God so that he can use you, or you're worth less to God. Because he's saying, I can't do anything with you because you're still stuck in the world. You've got to let that go. So what about discipleship? Is it worth the cost? And the answer is a resounding yes. In Luke 14 and verse 14, he says there, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. What Jesus is saying there is no cost that you can pay in following me that won't be made up to you 1,000-fold at the resurrection. Jesus says, throw it out there. Tell me something that you think is too high of a cost. He says, I got you trumped all day long. I've got greatness. I've got things that you would just, it would blow your mind that I have in store for you if you will just give it up right now. So how committed are you to Jesus today? It's one of these things that when I was writing this, I had to check myself. What's in my life that I'm holding on to? What's keeping me from being all in for Jesus? I'm asking the same thing of each and every one of us here. Because there is no limit. It's not even the sky is the limit. There is no limit when we give everything over to him. He will use us in wonderful ways that we are not even prepared for if we will give it up. This morning, are you struggling with that? Do you have one foot in the world and one foot in the kingdom? Why not come to Jesus and tell him that? Let him work on you. And if you're not a child of God this morning, what's holding you back? Yes, the cost is extremely high, but it is so worth it. It is all worth it for Jesus. If we can help you in any way, won't you come as together we stand and sing?